In today's Footwork Focus Deep Dive, we're taking a look at hip rotations and hip switches. A hip rotation is a player's ability to partially pivot on either foot while rotating their hips towards the hoop in order to access another footwork such as a drop or a split. The partial pivot component of a hip rotation involves beginning your pivot turn and then lifting your foot off the floor mid-pivot in order to reposition the feet in the air. By changing up the foot that we're pivoting on and the direction that we're pivoting in, we can come up with a host of different combinations of different types of hip rotations. The first of these variations is going to be our outside hip rotation. This is done by performing our partial pivot on our outside foot, meaning our ball side foot. One of the great advantages of our outside hip rotation is that it creates space. As we shift our weight to our outside foot or back foot for the partial pivot, we'll reposition our body into our new footwork slightly further back than from the spot which we started. This creation of space can have several advantages, from the ability to now separate and shoot, or to separate and attack the closeout, as we see done here by Tyrese Halliburton. I really like this situation with Kemba right here, where the defender's trying to push up on him and play arm's length defense. Kemba makes him pay for his aggression by performing an outside hip rotation, which causes him to feel like he needs to move closer in order to maintain that arm's length distance, and now Kemba's blowing by as he hip rotates into his drop footwork. Our next option is going to be inside hip rotations, in which we are going to partial pivot on our inside or forward foot in order to access our drop. The inside hip rotation is advantageous for claiming space, as this footwork repositions our body forward from the spot where we started. Therefore, inside hip rotations are really advantageous for attacking towards the defense or trying to get into the defense with our shoulder by advancing towards them, causing them to make a reaction. Our next option is going to be a hip switch. Hip switches are technically not a hip rotation, but I like to teach them at the same time as we go over hip rotations because they involve that same rotation of the hips in order to get from a closed position to an attacking position. The main difference with our hip switch is we are not putting our weight towards one of our feet in order to perform a partial pivot, so there's no partial pivot. The only thing that happens is we lift both feet simultaneously and then switch our feet in order to access our drop to accelerate and attack. The benefits to hip switches as opposed to hip rotations is that, number one, they're a lot faster, since we're picking up both of our feet simultaneously in order to get into our drop as fast as possible. Number two, hip switch footwork allows us to keep our space instead of claiming or creating space. So if we want to stay in the exact same spot on the floor, we can do that most easily with a hip switch as opposed to an inside or outside hip rotation. So far we've gone over hip rotations that take us into a 90-degree turn. Now we're going to take a look at forward hip rotations, which take us into a 180-degree turn. Forward hip rotations involve a partial pivot in the forward direction in order to reposition the body going back towards the basket for an attack. This is a really good footwork for getting back into an attack after pulling the ball back out or retreating, but also forward hip rotations can be useful for performing a lot of different offensive actions, such as turning the corner efficiently on a pick and roll. It's important to note that your forward hip rotation is going to carry your body's position towards the inside foot on which you're partial pivoting on. Next up, we have reverse hip rotations, which allow us to turn 180 degrees, beginning with a reverse partial pivot on the outside or ball side leg. Like a forward hip rotation, a reverse hip rotation is also going to carry our body sideways towards the foot that we are partial pivoting on, in this case, the outside leg. The direction in which your hip rotation carries you is really important to consider in terms of spacing. Inside hip rotations carry you forward, outside hip rotations carry you backwards, and your forward and reverse hip rotations will carry you to one side or the other laterally. In the following clip, we can see Montrezl Harrell utilize reverse hip rotation into a drop in order to blow by the defense. If you watch closely, you can see Montrezl Harrell's body shift slightly left while he performs his reverse hip rotation. This is the natural shift towards the outside that goes hand in hand with reverse hip rotations. And as you can see, the defender also shifts slightly with this movement, and then when he has to change directions 2 more times within the same play, it's just too many changes of directions to keep up with, and he's getting blown by for a dunk. We can also perform reverse hip rotations on our inside leg. This is definitely a less common variation of reverse hip rotation. However, if you for some reason have the defender in front of you instead of on your back, this could be a useful footwork for protecting the ball and turning around back towards the basket. Our last and most complex hip rotation is going to be our inverted hip rotation, in which we do a complete 360-degree turn while still getting back into our drop footwork for an attack. The biggest change here is the addition of a single leg foot replacement before we begin our partial pivot into our hip rotation. The single leg foot replacement just refers to us bringing our back foot back under our body and using that foot as our partial pivot foot to complete a full 360-degree turn with our partial pivot. Inverted hip rotations are a great way to get all the benefits of a spin move, the 360-degree change of direction, while still maintaining our ability to read the defense, kind of slow down the pace, hesitate a little bit, and then make a read out of our drop footwork. So there you have it. Those are your hip rotations and hip switches. 7 different unique movements that you can utilize to get from a closed position back into attack position, while simultaneously being a master of your own spacing. Thanks for tuning in. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, keep working on your game.